All right, guys, welcome back to more macroeconomics, right? So we're just going to go ahead and jump into chapter 5. So if you have any questions on any of the material before chapter 5, go ahead and send me an email. I can make some extra videos or provide some links to the extra videos explaining that online, right? But chapter 5 is a really important one, right? Because this one is talking about how we measure things, right? So this one is talking about measurement. So it's talking about, our GDP. We'll learn what that stands for. It's talking about, unemployment. Which we hear discussed a lot in the news, right? It's talking about other measurements of economic growth or economic well-being. So essentially, these, we can think about these as the vital signs of the economy. Employment, the unemployment, the average work hours. So you might have a bunch of people employed, right? But what if they're all, involuntarily part-time, right? That's the problem with Japan. It's not necessarily that they have a lot of unemployment. It's the fact that a lot of their people that are employed aren't getting enough work hours. What are some of the other vital signs that we look at, right? We look at the stock values and trends. What do I mean by trend? I just mean, is it increasing or is it decreasing or is it, just kind of doing a crazy thing? We have no idea. Price, time. And lastly, the one that's probably the most esoteric to us all is going to be prices and inflation. So we enjoy and have enjoyed a relatively low inflation environment for quite some time, right? What does that mean? It means that prices don't really change that much, right? On average, rent might grow a little bit. Gas used to get more expensive constantly, but now it's like, it gets expensive, and then they figure out a new way to get gas out of the ground. It goes cheaper, and then it gets more expensive again, and then cars become way more efficient, and then it gets cheaper, and so. That's part of the reason why when we talk about prices and when we talk about inflation, a lot of times we'll leave out gas, we'll leave out energy prices, because of energy prices that they have these erratic movements that are kind of unrelated to the rest of the economy, right? But think about food prices, think about the price of clothing, right? It doesn't change very much, right? It hasn't increased significantly over the last 5, 10, 20 years. And these kind of things, right? These vital signs, these are often the things that we hear on the news, right? These are usually the news, the broadcastings. And, when were these developed? We didn't really have these until after World War II. And this guy named Copeland decided, hey, we should start taking a national production and income account as well as a flow of funds account. It's called the flow of funds. And so, this one is talking about how much stuff is being made, stuff and services, produced and sold. And this one is about, kind of where is money going? Both, internally or domestically, right? And international. And the purpose of this, right? Why did they do this? Well, they wanted to make a common system and measurements for everyone, right? You think about like a metric system. Metric system for economies, right? And luckily, unlike the metric system, right, where we are like the only holdouts in the world, we since we came up with this one, we participated in it. So when we talk about this GDP, there's a very specific definition that we have here, okay? So GDP, triple equal sign, defined as the market value of the final goods and services and then the third part is produced in a country in a given period of time. So when we talk about GDP, are we talking about, this shirt that I got at the thrift store? No, that's not a final good or service. That's a secondary sale. So anything that's used is not counted as part of GDP. What if we produce something but never sell it? Actually, I'm going to get back to you. I'm pretty sure but the way that this is defined saying that since it's just defined as produce, if we produce it but don't sell it, we store it as inventory, it becomes part of GDP. So produced, I'll correct myself on Monday if it's wrong. I'll send the video. Produced, but inventory is still part of GDP. Oh, I know why. We'll get into that in a second. I know why. And then it's in a country, right? So we could talk about the GDP of Nebraska. So it could be a state. You talk about the GDP of the world. Right? I actually have a cool little. I pulled up a little thing of the GDP of the world in one chart. So we see that we've got 23.89%. Now this was 2018. And this is GDP, not GNP. I think China has bigger GNP, gross national product, which we'll talk about. We might talk about that. It's a different way to measure. So, you know, we've got Brazil and Mexico, Japan, India, right? So these are the big economies. Australia's down there. A bunch of the small economies are just lumped in there. And then we've got color coding here for the different regions of the world. So that our GDP is the measure of all the final stuff. So let's do a quick example just so that we have this clear in our mind in terms of what GDP is. So let's say that we have, you know, we're playing a video game like SimCity or something, right? And we have, or, you know, Animal Crossing, right? And we have Orcadia. We've got apples and bananas and shoes. And let's say that the price, which is perfectly reflecting the willingness to pay of the consumers, of the apples is 25 cents, bananas is 50 cents, and shoes is $20. And let's say that the individual quantity that's demanded in Arcadia, you only have 3 residents right now, right? So you've only got 3 pairs of shoes they want. Each one of them wants 2 bananas, and you know, one of them loves apples, the other one not so much. They want to get 4 apples. So how would we figure out the total GDP for Orcadia? Well, we would literally just multiply the price times the quantity for each one of these different sectors, right? So this would be $1, this would be $3, this would be $60. We add them all up, right? 1 plus 3 plus 60, and we end up with $64 as the GDP for Arcadia. Questions on that? So what we just talked about were 3 market goods, right? The apples, bananas, and the shoes, right? But we have some non-market goods that are also included here, right? So what are some of the non-market goods that are still a part of GDP, right? Still in GDP. So what's been in the news all summer, and I mean lately, there's been 2 different things in the news we can talk about, right? Firefighters, cops, you know, national defense. So what I'm talking about here is I'm talking about all of the government goods and services that aren't sold in the market. We have to remember that these things have value. You know, we would not produce as much if we had to essentially be our own firefighters, if we had to fortify our property as if we lived in little fiefdoms, right? And you know, lived in Mad Max days, right? You know, so these things have value. The presence of them increases overall output mean, and that is just patently, empirically, right? When I talk about empirically, I mean, the data shows that this is true. Now we can talk about, maybe a little is good, some is better, a lot is bad. And there might be, diminishing returns, right? In terms of when we have too much government intervention, too big of a government, or, we can talk about the federal versus state governments and the size of those respectively, right? But just the presence of security and having institutions and having, courts that you can sue people in and cops that can, kick people out of places after they've been sued, or garnish their wages, right? This kind of enforcement increases overall output. The security in that enforcement. Loans would be a lot riskier. People would be a lot less willing to provide medical services without being paid cash up front, so on and so forth. The quantities, of this, right, are somewhat known. The book says that they're known, but I would say they're somewhat known. We have no idea how many fires we're going to have. And look at Seattle right now. They have no idea how many cops they needed. They're asking for help from the governor of Oregon, asking for help from the counties around Portland, and them saying no. And so I would argue they didn't know the quantities demanded for that particular public good. And we can't establish prices for these things, right? Because they're a public good, right? So they're public good. So what does that mean? That means it's non-rival, non-excludable. So, when I make things safe, or when the National Guard or the police make things more safe for the taxpayer or the person who owns the store, they're also making safe for the person who doesn't pay taxes, or the immigrant who's not even a U.S. citizen, that's just visiting here, whatever, right? And non-rival is, essentially your enjoyment of safety, or your enjoyment of, having the fires put down before they come and burn your house down, doesn't take away from somebody else's enjoyment of that as well. So that's the rivalry, right? So a lot of people feel very justified in stealing, online content, right? Because it's non-rival. It's just, you're just making copies of ones and zeros when you steal a song or a movie or something like that, right? Whereas if you go into the store and you steal something from Walmart, a lot of people feel a little worse about it, right? Because that's a rival, that's one less lamp or whatever that somebody in the world can purchase. That kind of makes sense? And excludable, usually the goods that we consume are excludable, but some non-excludable goods that we consume. What were some non-excludable goods that we consumed at the beginning of July? Goods that we can't stop other people from enjoying, from looking at and enjoying. Happening at the beginning of July. Yeah. Fireworks, right? So there's fireworks. Fireworks are very non-excludable, right? So are flowers, so is, vaccination, right? So these are all non-excludable goods. All right, so this is part of GDP, right? So essentially, we value this at cost. If there's waste and inefficiency, then we have an overstated GDP. And there is, and there's tons of waste and inefficiency, particularly in the military sector. So I study, our military spending, like the military spending abroad, and the incentive structure that's set up there is very perverse because it's all use it or lose it. So if you don't spend your budget all that year, the next budget you get a smaller budget. Next year you get a smaller budget. So you end up buying things that you don't necessarily need just to kind of fill out that budget. Same thing with the overseas housing allowance. If you get a housing allowance, that's a ton of money, and you don't use it all, the next year you're going to get less of a housing allowance. And it's not as if that extra money goes to your paycheck. So you're just losing, this perceived benefit, right? And so what ends up happening is, a lot of these GIs will kind of team up together and get, these giant houses that they would never ordinarily be able to afford. And, sometimes they actually drive up the local prices and the rental prices of the area when the basing operations scale up there as a result of the overseas housing allowance and kind of, the largesse and the extra demand that it brings. But, you hear stories about, $70 rolls of duct tape and things like that, right? That they're, super special duct tape or whatever, right? And it's just, it's all overstated costs and bloat and inefficiency, right? And that's why, our military spends so much money, and it's like it's the only government agency that hasn't been audited. I think it's been audited once, and they were like half audited. So it's final goods and services, not intermediate goods and services. What are we talking about when we say final goods and services, right? We're talking about ones that are ultimately consumed by the user. It might not necessarily be the purchaser, but the user, right? So this is the end products of production. Products. This is so we do include these in GDP. Whereas our intermediate goods and services these are the materials used to produce the final goods and services. So these are not counted to avoid double counting. So if a barber's assistant earns $2 for sweeping up, and the barber charges $10 for a haircut, GDP only increases by $10, not the $2 that the barber makes. That the assistant makes. So milk, so sometimes things can be, intermediate or final, right? Milk can be sold to stores as an intermediate one, to restaurants as an intermediate one. It can be sold to consumers, right? What are some other types of goods, right? We have capital goods. Capital goods, right? And so these are long-lived goods. Long-lived goods used in the production of other goods and services. So, what are some capital goods? Great question. We've got houses, apartments, motels, just land in general, factories, schools. We've got stoves in restaurants. Smoothie machines. Espresso machines, right, for coffee places. We've got delivery vehicles for Just Love and stuff. These are all capital goods, all right? What we need to remember here, money is not a capital good. Okay? Never. Never, never, never. Just like money is not an investment. Money is not a capital good. Money is just the unit of account. Just something that helps us avoid that double coincidence of wants, right? That hungry tailor meeting the freezing baker. And so when we talk about consumer expenditures, we essentially have, we've got durable and non-durable goods, right? So non-durable goods, these are things like clothing, food, bedding. These are things that, are short-lived. Durable goods are things that are, you guessed it, long-lived, right? So cars, furniture, good appliances, not so much anymore. And in terms of consumer expenditure, services are the largest component. So, services are, haircuts, education, financial services, the big one. So anything that's sold, that doesn't have a good, right? That they're providing something, but it's not in physical form. So massage is a service, tutoring, lots of different things. Mowing your lawn, fixing your car, all sorts of stuff. So this is the first part of our GDP, is the consumer expenditure. When we talk about GDP, we have this equation, y equals C plus I plus G plus NX, X, not G, NX. And so this is the C part, the consumer expenditure part. Now the next part that we're going to talk about is the I part, right? The investment part. So we talked about capital goods. So we know what investment is on. But investment specifically is essentially is capital good purchases by firms, right? So spending by firms on goods and services. And so this is going to be plants, different plants, pieces of property, new equipment, residential investment, right? That's the construction of new homes and apartment buildings. And so the reason why I was kind of tripped up a little bit before, and then I said, oh yeah, it's actually just things produced, right? Is because of this right here. Inventory investment. This is the change in unsold inventory, unsold goods. So they're produced but not sold. And this entry can be positive or negative. So let's say you produce stuff, but you didn't sell it. It's still going to be part of GDP. It's not going to be part of the consumption part, but it's going to be part of the investment part because it's going to be an increase in the inventory investment. So it's very important we keep in mind at this point, right, that this kind of investment here, this is what we think of as capital investment, right? And a lot of times when you hear, you know, your parents or other people talking about investment on the news or whatever, right, they're talking about something that is financial investments. So this is, you know, the purchasing of stocks, bonds, you know, crypto, right, other financial stuff. Now, it's important to keep in mind here that these financial investments are generally, unless it's an IPO, an initial public offering, right? Unless it's like the first day of trading, they're generally just transfers of ownership of that firm's existing capital stock. So what does that mean? That means that the purchasing of this, right, buying a share of GM doesn't correspond to any physical investment or increase in, you know, productive capital capacity, right? So it's not going to correspond to any increase in, you know, physical capital or, you know, productive capacity. Now, what is the exception to this? Well, there's really two exceptions to this. I just talked about one of the exceptions, right? What's the other exception? So the exception is the IPO because that's the initial public offering. Why is that the exception? What happens when they do the initial public offering? What happens when there's that first day of them going out there what are they doing? Well, they're taking a chunk of their company and they're selling it to the public, and they're getting money from it, right? So on that first day, in that initial public offering, the IPO, they are getting extra money that they're going to turn into capital. The other exception is when they issue new stock. They issue new stock, then they're going to build up their capital from that new stock. So compare this financial investment to, an economic investment. Which is an increase in capital goods to produce other goods and services. Now, when we talk about our G, right, this is our government spending. This is a whole bunch of stuff, right? This is fighter jets, teachers, office supplies for the Pentagon and the White House and everywhere, right? So these are just final goods and services purchased by federal, local, state governments, right? Now, here's a really important part. I think so, because it's a huge, huge chunk of it. This excludes transfer payments. So what are these transfer payments? Well, they're exactly like they seem. These are payments from one government to government. Where no current goods and services are exchanged or received. This wouldn't be a big deal, and this kind of wasn't a big deal. These transfer payments are actually quite a lot of money, right? We use these transfer payments as political levers, right? So you guys probably don't remember this, but 2003, we decided that we were going to go to war with Iraq and we were going to take out Saddam Hussein. Well, we wanted to come at him from Kuwait, which we'd already helped, fight off and defend in the early 90s. So we had a nice little base there. And we also wanted to come at him from the north, from Turkey. Well, President Erdogan didn't much like that. And he said no. And we said, well, you realize we give you $250 million of aid every year, right? And he said, yeah. And he said, okay, well, you realize that's discretionary, right? He said, yeah. He said, okay, well, we're gonna lower that to $20 million this year. And so then they went to the what happens? So then he said, okay, I'll do it. But then the legislature, the Turkish, Congress essentially, overruled him and said no. And so then, we kind of hit him with these, essentially the equivalent of like sanctions, right? We lowered the amount of money that we usually give them every year as a kind of punishment, right, for not allowing what we would call an easement here in the United States domestically, right? So when the power company or when the water company has a right to come on a part of your property, or how like there's a sidewalk that's on the front part of everybody's property, and it's technically not yours, but it kind of is, and like you're responsible for like paving it, even though the city owns it. That's an easement, right? So it's the right to be there and to do whatever how they want to it, despite your ownership of it or whatever, right? So the U.S. was kind of asking for a similar international easement, and Turkey said no, and we went ahead and we pulled these transfer payments, right? These transfer payments are huge, tools of what's called U.S. soft power. right? So if we think about hard power as, sending in boots on the ground, or just sending in drones, right? A lot of times, then the soft power would be pulling these kind of transfer payments, maybe giving transfer payments to countries that don't much like you, and maybe compete against you, or maybe are fighting a proxy war against you, right? If we think about, yeah. So there's all sorts of very fun stuff that these transfer payments contribute to. So what's this last part of this, Chris? The part that where you were like NG, NX, and whatever, right? So let's real quick talk about that. So NX, right? This is my net exports. My net exports, right? So what does this mean? This means it's all of my exports minus my imports. Okay, that's a little bit more, but what the hell are exports and imports? Well, exports is all the goods and services produced here sold abroad. So, all of the TV shows, all the music, all of the ammunition, all of the financial services, all of the, I'm trying to think of what else, food that we sell externally, that's called exports. What about imports? Imports. Well, imports, these are purchases of goods and services, the purchases that are in the United States, right? So these are purchases made here, US purchases of goods and services that are produced not in the US. Not in the USA, right? Produced somewhere else. So, what do we import? Does anyone know where any of their clothing is made? Nope, all imported, right? Computers, the design of it is here in the United States, but they sure as hell ain't built here or assembled here. You gonna say something else, or did I pick clothing already? Yeah. Backpacks, these chairs probably, lots and lots of stuff, right? I think this is like this kind of stuff's probably made in the US. There's a lot of paper products that are still made in the USA. But a lot of clothing, a lot of plastics, a lot of electronics, a lot of that stuff is imported elsewhere. While it may be designed here, so Apple, the classic, it's designed here, it's marketed here, right? So it's a US company, but it's still really an imported good at the end of the day. Because it's built and assembled, manufactured and assembled abroad. And so the way in which we measure GDP, any increase in exports decreases the GDP, or sorry, any increase in the imports decreases your GDP, right? And so if you wanted to, kind of boost that GDP measure, right? If you wanted to increase this, right, which any good politician wants to, then what are you going to want to do? You're going to want to boost your exports abroad, and you're going to want to lower your imports, right? And so that's also part of what, the economic policy that's going on right now is doing, or what the intent of it, is. It actually hasn't succeeded because it has decreased imports as much as it's decreased exports. And so the change to net exports has been very, very little. So the goal of it was, we're going to slap all these tariffs, we're going to make it easier for United States steel and other industries to compete so that they can sell products internally, so that US companies no longer have to import that from abroad. Well, that kind of happened, but then also the countries that we slap tariffs on our goods, and so then our exports decreased to those countries a corresponding amount. So at the end of the day, anything that we gained in terms of GDP from the lowering of that import volume was erased, or obliviated, or whatever, right? Offset, compensated by the decrease in exports that were the result in the kind of retributive policies. So at the end of the day, when we're comparing GDP, now that we know all the parts of it, right? When we're comparing it, we have to keep in mind that prices change over time, okay? Prices usually increase, bit by bit over time. So what does this mean? Well, this means that we have to take what's called our nominal GDP. So you can think of nominal as essentially, your nominal GDP is your paycheck. It's what you get. It's what you take home. So it's it's all the money after taxes, after insurance, after whatever, right? It's the $738.18. Okay, that's your nominal GDP. So it's the current output at current prices. Now, what happens if we want to compare economic output over time? What happens if you want to compare your wage over time? If you were making $40,000 10 years ago, and now you're making $44,000, you probably actually haven't gotten that much of a raise. Because in the last 10 years, the standard of living has increased so much so that the goods and services that you used to be able to buy with that $40,000 has decreased. And so, yeah, you're making $4,000 or more dollars, but everything costs a little more. Gas costs more, housing costs more, food costs more, blah, 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 right? And so we have to convert this nominal GDP into something that's more apples to apples, right? To what's called a real GDP, which I wish there was a better name, right? That's what we got. And this is the current output, so the current output, but prices from a base year. And then it would say something like at the 2000 prices. So at prices that were in existence in 2000, or at prices that were in existence in 2010. So essentially they go and they divide by the current price, and they say, well, how many things are sold? And then they figure out what the price was in 2000, and they multiply it by that price in order to get that real GDP, so that it's apples to apples, right? And the differences are very stark, especially when you start to go back 70 years, right? And that's why when you might hear your grandpa or somebody, my dad's super old, so it's probably your grandpa's age. He's like 75. That talks about how cheap everything was and everything, and how his first wage was $1 an hour or something, right? Well, $1 got you a lot more back then. And so that's what the real GDP is compensating for. The real GDP is essentially taking that nominal GDP and converting it to something that we can then say, okay, you got $1, that's what you actually got, but the equivalent was you got $7.50, which is minimum wage this day, so that kind of makes sense. All right, I will see you guys on Monday. I'll send out the reflection essay, and I'll let you know how you did on last week's by email by the end of today. Oh wait, see you on Wednesday. I don't know what time of year it is.